want to shoot a little bit of a response here real quickly to some of the comments that Pyrrho 314 had posted on this video that had been done on humility and range. And I had said this line, about degrees and differences of, when you get a bachelor. I mean, this is an old sort of saying, right? It says if you get a bachelor's degree, you think you know everything. When you get a master's degree, you realize you know nothing. When you get a PhD, you discover that no one knows anything. Something like this. And I think the person writes that doesn't seem too promising a picture for academic learning. One knows less and less. Okay, and again, I don't really know and he says, of course, I know what you mean, but in my case, my bachelor's degree taught me what other people thought, not what I thought. For that, I had to rely on my own methods. And then he goes on and he says, while PhDs often say they've learned they know nothing, it's just as often a way to say others know nothing. Few of them are opinionless. What worth would they be if they were? And so again, those were his comments, and I wanted to say a couple of things about all of that. I guess the first, maybe just basic response that I would say to that is that I do think there is something about the value of learning to question and to interrogate assumptions. See, some people believe that learning is actually a kind of unlearning, and it's interrogating assumptions, presuppositions. And to that extent, it's really not gaining knowledge so much as removing things that you thought you knew but just really weren't correct, right? And so sometimes people say, yeah, it's not what we know, but what we think we know but just ain't so, right? There's so much that is not really about gaining. And what does it mean to even say, my bachelor's degree taught me what other people thought, not what I thought. For that, I had to rely upon my own methods. Yeah, so George Gustorf, he says that normally the life of the mind doesn't begin with the acquisition of language. It begins with the revolt against language once it's acquired. This notion that your mind is a reaction against what you've learned. I think much of that is true, but then it means, what have you learned? So the more that you've studied, the more revolt that you can have going on. I mean, this notion of what academic learning is as opposed to what kind of learning. Experiential learning? Oh, who's denying that? I don't think anybody wants to deny the importance of experiential learning. You don't learn to juggle by reading a book. I don't think anybody's learned to play the violin by reading about it. I think some of that is almost absurd when pushed to the extreme. But I don't know if I want to say, though, that this ability to realize that one doesn't really know the way one thought one did, or what does one even mean by the word know? What is knowledge? Does one have a real clear definition of knowledge, or is the definition itself fuzzy, and is that okay? Or does one have to have a very clear definition of what knowledge is? That to me sounds very academic. Now, if I say, well, a person doesn't really have to have a very clear definition of what they mean by knowledge, instead we kind of just live by an operational sort of definition of knowledge. We mean, well, do you know it? Can you remember it? Can you factually get around? Can you recall it? If we're looking for something, was it true or was it false? We have all those sorts of sensibilities. My sense is that when we're talking about someone who's discovering that they realize that no one knows anything, they're coming to see that culture itself was for the longest time treated like reality. Many people, it's like when you walk up to a fish and you say to the fish, hey, what do you think of the water? And the fish says, what water? I think we're so swimming in our own cultural interpretations, in interpretations that are culturally mass distributed, culturally intelligible, and then we don't even realize that. We think it's an expression of the way the world is. I had a student who came over here from a certain part of an African community where women were required to have very, strict leg coverage at all points. I mean, ankles were seen as um, erotic, and you weren't supposed to be exposing your lower legs. Well, he came over here, and it was driving him crazy. He couldn't believe the way that some of the students were dressing on campus. Now, it's funny that a lot of people don't even think of that like an interpretation. Um, there's a kind of knowledge there that you become aware of, and when you become aware of it, there is a kind of knowing, but it's also a kind of unlearning, a releasing of what you thought you knew. Okay, well, anyway, those are some of the responses I'd want to say to this question of um, does academic learning, I mean, I don't know why there's such a disdain for that. Is it a disdain for book culture? Is it books in general? I mean, if it's books in general, I'd maybe share the sympathy. It would depend upon what the reasons are for people being so against books. Um, but all right, thanks.